know the context, know the environment before you get any fancy ideas. It's very simple. And you can only get to know the context if actually you have somebody invested time in hearing from those who are in the context.
Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. In each episode, we engage with diplomats, peace builders, and lawyers who have played key roles in efforts to resolve conflicts around the world through dialogue and legal frameworks. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Today, I am honored to welcome back my good friend, Ivan Nielsen, a former Danish diplomat with extensive experience in conflict resolution and constitution building, and an expert in human rights and international law. Ivan has held roles including with the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the United Nations, and the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Ivan, welcome to the program.
Thanks a lot, Paul, and many thanks for inviting me back after our previous exchange, I guess, 2 months ago.
I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, Ivan. For our listeners, we're going to spend the next hour taking a deep dive into Ivan's role as special envoy to the Syrian opposition during the Geneva peace talks. Now, the Geneva peace talks were a years-long, United Nations-backed international peace conference that aimed to bring an end to the Syrian regime's relentless attacks on its own civilian population. The talks brought together the Syrian government and the opposition to attempt to negotiate an end to the conflict at a time where it was envisioned for regime transformation and the hope for creation of a democratic Syria. Let's jump right into our conversation with Ivan here. Now, Ivan, you were appointed as the special envoy to the opposition in late 2013. Can you set the scene for our listeners and walk us through the state of the conflict in Syria and what your role was during this time?
Thanks, Paul. Actually, I joined the Syria file as early as mid-2012. And then, yes, I was formally appointed as special envoy approximately a year later. So I joined the file somewhat a year and a bit into the revolution. As we all know, the popular uprising starting in southern Syria and then quickly, almost like a bushfire in a good way, spread throughout Syria. And as we know, approximately, well, as early as months into the conflict, and for sure a year into the conflict, had become more and more militarized as the regime and its backers cracked down on the popular uprising, and really with an iron fist that we haven't seen repeated in many other places, basically try to crack the voices of the streets. In parallel with the, let's say, the increased violence and crackdowns, we obviously also saw increased international engagement in the conflict, where most notably the allies of the regime, Russia and Iran in particular, provided basically unlimited support for the regime to be able to push back and survive. And then the Friends of the Syrian People, the international Friends of the Syrian People, they likewise provided some different kinds of support, whether it was political, a bit militarily, and some financially as well. But I guess we come a bit back to that imbalance a bit later in our exchange today. So very quickly, the opposition was actually able to conquer large parts of the Syrian territory before the regime somewhat benefited from the support from Russia and Iran in particular. And then some years into the conflict, we had more or less the gist of a frozen conflict with frozen conflict lines. And then obviously, as we will come back to later, we saw what then happened in December last year when there was a very radical change. It all went crazy in a good way, leading to the departure of Assad. I may also want to add here that some observations and some lessons learned I quickly, let's say, established were that, and having the benefit of being able to compare with many other conflicts, even though we should from the outset say that no two conflicts are similar, let alone comparable, but we may be able to still zoom in on some specifics, is that I've rarely seen such a dedicated, courageous, persisting opposition among Syrians who really wanted change. And change was defined as the radical changes in Damascus, and including the departure of the previous dictator. And I must say that the courage was just basically heartwarming. It was almost, let's say, heartbreaking to see that they just kept fighting with the weapons, in inverted commas, they had available, which was not comparable and could not match the weapons of the oppression they were met with. And I think, and we may also get back to that a bit later, that was somewhat also the building block, this popular uprising for here 14 years later to have a significantly strengthened, remarkable Syrian civil society in general. And I think that is one of the reasons that we all have, let's say, hope for the way forward on that journey towards the new Syria forward.
Ivan, it's definitely been a number of zigs and zags over the last decade, and it's ended now with the fall of the Assad regime and a transformation, which gives us all quite a bit of hope. But can you unpack for me Denmark's strategic interest? One of the things that we found so impressive engaging with PLPG during the negotiations was your central role. You were Denmark's envoy to the Syrian opposition, but you were highly respected. Quite frankly, your counsel was highly sought after by the other envoys. You knew this issue inside and out, partly because of your time as ambassador in Syria. But can you walk us through why was Denmark so invested in the peace process in Geneva and in a democratic transformation in Syria itself?
I think here we also have to go back to when the revolution broke out in 2011. Somewhat happened on the back of a couple of decades where Denmark had I would definitely say an active foreign policy, and I would even say almost an activistic foreign policy, where basically we together with like-minded joined international efforts in promoting and pushing back with different means when fundamental universal values were under pressure and if not directly attacked. As we know, some of those engagements, including some of the collective engagements, were obviously fundamentally different. Mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan, but when it comes to Syria, I think it was a combination of that. And then yet again, the Danish foreign and security policy, even more at the time, was actually driven by this policy commitment to stand on the right side of the fundamental universal values. As one of my envoy colleagues at the time kept on also saying, that it's actually quite, and obviously I took that and almost put it on my CV. It was quite amazing how Danish diplomats were so principled, and it was as if the fundamental universal values were in their DNA. Obviously, we implemented policy, but that DNA was somewhat manifested in our security and foreign policy. So in essence, I would say it's a combination of the way we see ourselves in the world, the international arena, joining hands with others, but also with a very focused approach on standing for the right thing. Let's define it as the universal, fundamental universal values for the purposes of this exchange right now. I would also then, just to complete this a tiny bit, say that like many other countries, some years into the conflict, I would say around 2018, 2019, there was this element of conflict fatigue, and competing agendas. Bandwidth were being occupied with other global issues deserving attention. And then what we saw in Denmark was also that Denmark actually gradually focused less on promoting and supporting those fundamental universal values, and actually the implementation of 2254 in general, including the pursuit of a political solution, and rather focused on more, let's say, more narrow interest, basically some of the symptoms and not the root causes. So if one is to be a bit cynical, a lot of the Danish focus became, which was also something I frustrated me a bit, and I did not, let's say, fully agree with. And also that was not where I brought most value to the table. It more or less became about addressing Syrian refugees, including Syrians in Denmark, and also somewhat finding ways and means to avoid that individuals with Danish passports who had either been caught in the conflict in Northeast, the foreign fighters' families did not return to Denmark.
No, I recall the early days when we first met, the highly principled and highly rule of law focused approach of both you as the envoy and Denmark. And then over the course of the evolution, there's always some degree of uncomfortable evolution. But even to the very end of the Geneva process, your brief was quite keen and quite focused on rule of law, rules-based order, and democracy. Let's talk a little bit about how that played out in getting the parties to Geneva. There was various rounds of Geneva, but can you share with our audience some of your observations on what generally drove the opposition to the Geneva process and what drove the Assad regime to the Geneva process? Did either of them have a genuine interest in reaching an agreement? Was this interest symmetrical? And if it was asymmetrical, how did that impact the negotiations?
Yeah, I think it is fair to say that it was anything but symmetrical. Some years into the conflict and somewhat, a year into it. So at the time I had joined the Syria file. The international community basically at large were rallying and supporting the formation of a representative opposition body, the one we call it TILAF, and the one which was formed in I think it was November 2012, and with the intention of actually having the opposition, those forces and voices wanting changes, to somewhat have somebody negotiate on their behalf. And I think the group of like-minded were instrumental in supporting and encouraging the formation of that, and also having their back in Geneva. Sadly enough, it was almost the complete opposite when it comes to the regime, because even though their international friends were significantly less in numbers, and I recall that there was a big tent meeting of the Friends of the Syrian People in Marrakesh, Morocco in late 2012. I think more than 100 countries were actually represented, all signing up to 2254 only came about later, but all signing up to the need for a political solution and somewhat in different ways recognizing Itilaf as the actor to negotiate on behalf of those wanting changes. On the other side, we had the regime. Obviously, we should name both Russia, Iran, but also about the usual suspects like North Korea and others who clearly just did the opposite. And sadly enough, they provided the regime with much more support militarily, financially, and politically. And so there was that mismatch between the volume of support on the one side and the other side. And obviously, while the political support to the opposition was both relevant, needed, commendable, and also in many ways impressive, but on the ground, it meant that the regime was very comfortable in not engaging in Geneva in good faith. And when they finally engaged, or at least pretended to engage, it was basically confined to traveling to Geneva and sitting in Geneva, because there was absolutely no genuine willingness to engage or even get near political negotiations. And I guess their analysis was also that if they were to do that, that would actually constitute the beginning of the end of the regime. So I would also say, actually question whether there has ever been a political process on Syria, in that there were meetings, yes, but there was this fundamental asymmetrical, let's say, approach between the way the opposition approached it and the way the regime approached.
Well, Ivan, let's unpack and dive into that a little bit more from the perspective of the international community. So can you first map out for us the architecture? These were UN-led talks, but you were there as the Danish envoy. The Americans had an envoy, the Brits and others had envoys. Can you walk us through a little bit the architecture of what this process looked like from the international side? And then also add on to that a bit of a discussion about how did this international mediation team deal with the asymmetry of interest and actually getting to yes on a peace agreement?
I think what led to the first significant meeting in Geneva was actually effectively an agreement that the US and its allies, like-minded countries, would somewhat encourage and support the opposition and have their back, go to Geneva and negotiate. And then as part of the division of labor was that Russia would actually deliver the regime going to Geneva as well, and on paper doing the same. But I do question whether actually Russia really applied the pressure that was necessary for the regime to somewhat engage, and we saw that they did not engage at all. I recall and before getting back to other bits of the international architecture, I recall that one of my friends at the time was actually inside some of the rooms where you had the UN at the table. And at a certain point, a senior UN official was as I was told, was getting very frustrated about the lack of engagement by the regime and its delegation. And out of almost frustration, the senior UN official asked the head of the regime delegation, so how long will you keep on having this, let's say, non-engagement approach, if not even destructive approach? And then I was told the response was very simple: I will sit here as long as it takes. And I think that tells us quite well what the difference between the two levels of engagement. The opposition was genuinely throughout committed to engage with the political backing behind it, and the regime was somewhat comfortable enough and did not feel the pressure to do anything but provide a certain presence. And that also meant that they were playing for time, basically. As I'm sure also came your way, Paul, during the many rounds where both you and I somewhat margin participated in the numerous Geneva meetings, was that there were so many examples of the regime delegation effectively just being destructive, putting spanner in the wheels, using all kinds of tools in the toolbox to apply delaying tactics. And I recall one of the favorite ones was that at times the regime delegation and its individuals actually had a lengthy exchange with the UN administration and somewhat almost complaining about why the UN did not provide business class tickets and all the like. And all of this added up that time was just running out, because normally, as you also know more than anybody else, Paul, we met in Geneva normally for some 3 or 4 or 5 days. But if you can run the clock down by talking about stuff like this, then you will somewhat, the focus will go elsewhere. Everybody left Geneva again. And then it took a lot of political capital pressure and the like to get the regime even back to Geneva, if not only to sit in the chair. On the international engagement and the architecture, yes, yet again, the numbers, not that we turn into a numbers game, but basically the entire world with the ones I mentioned before, they really invested heavy political capital in supporting actors wanting the basic changes in Syria. So there were many different configurations, and very much in line with the Danish very active approach and the privilege that the foreign ministry invested in a dedicated envoy position, which is not that normal in the Danish system, and allowed me to, let's say, occupy that or have that hat on for almost 9 years, meant that Denmark actually unusually so very on equal footing participating in groups of like-minded countries. We had different envoys configurations. So I worked very closely with not only the US, but the UK and France and Germany, and obviously actors from the region, whether it was the Arab countries or Turkey. And then there were also a few others that, depending on the specific topics, engaged. But the core was somewhat the one I mentioned before.
Well, Ivan, let's pivot a little bit to your personal story and share with us how you found yourself involved with the Syria portfolio and then becoming the envoy and engaging in these negotiations. You were in the Danish Foreign Ministry pursuing a career as a Foreign Service officer. And when did the phone ring and what did they say and what was your response?
Yeah, actually, and I don't even know if you're aware of that, Paul, but I fell into the foreign ministry trap relatively late in my career. So if you'll allow me, let me go a few years back in time, even close to memory lane a bit, because I was doing all sorts of other international stuff after I graduated from law school, primarily in and around the human rights environment, but not in a government capacity. And among the highlights were that actually I was so privileged that I was a part of the otherwise exclusive South African team, which facilitated the constitution-making process in South Africa in the mid-90s. And later on, I became an advisor to the South African Parliament. Also, I was unique in a different way. I was privileged to be one of the first civilians to travel to Iraq in the post-Saddam Hussein era. So I guess against all of that, the foreign ministry saw the potential in my profile to be basically a bit of a connector to the ground. And not only who knew the real deal, what happens on the ground, but also knew the politics. And then when I joined the foreign ministry, actually primarily on a human rights portfolio, finally, I can't remember when it was, 2007, then only some 6 months later, I believe it was, I was asked to become our deputy ambassador in Kabul. And then after that, I was appointed as Denmark's senior civilian representative in Helmand province in southern Afghanistan. Basically, the senior Danish civilian guy in that province where we focused our contributions, whether it was militarily, politically, or even financial support. And I should also add, actually, where Denmark, we were fighting alongside our US and UK allies in particular. And You may also know that our engagement in Afghanistan actually cost the lives of 43 of our brave men and women in the war in Afghanistan. And actually, we lost more soldiers per capita than any other country except the US. But then fast forward, then all of that, I guess, meant that the foreign ministry saw my profile as the one that could spearhead our engagement, our support to all those forces wanting changes in Syria. So I got the famous phone call, and in all honesty, it took me less than a second to nod yes. And then the rest is obviously almost history now, but clearly a lot of material for a book I may do one day. I should also say that during the first years of my position as envoy, let's say 5 or 6 years, so I'm definitely up to 17, 18, I was very privileged to enjoy a strong political support and often direct engagement from the foreign ministers I was serving under. I've served under 5 different foreign ministers, and it should be added from 4 different political parties, which says a bit about our parliamentary and democratic tradition. But the line was the same. That was support to 2254, support to the actors wanting the changes that would address the root cause of the conflict. And then I guess also coming back to the previous question, that heavy political support from respective ministers also contributed greatly to be able to mandate and empower me to somewhat engage with the big ones, US, UK, France and Germany and the like, which Denmark does not always do, even though we generally punch above our weight.
Ivan, in large part based upon your experience in South Africa, Iraq, and Afghanistan, you had developed a knack or a rhythm for creating deep and intense relationships with, well, for PLPG, we would call them clients. For Denmark, they weren't your clients, but they were your interlocutors. And you had an impressive ability to be able to have access and to share your thoughts and insights with the leadership of the opposition. And they were faced with a very difficult situation. They wanted to and needed to be in Geneva. They were in these negotiations with an intransigent government. What was some of the strategic advice? I often remember at the Royal Hotel or the Intercontinental, you'd be over in the corner with the leadership, chatting them up and sharing your thoughts and ideas. And maybe now you can share with us, what were some of the strategies or tactics that you were suggesting to the opposition for how they navigate this asymmetric peace process?
Well, I guess before we get to the real interesting bit, what you ask into, I also have some more, let's say, mainstream diplomatic responsibilities. And we know the drill. The conventional tools were obviously to convey messaging as and when relevant about there's only a political solution and not a military solution. It's about implementing 2254. It's about encouraging the regime and encourage Russia to encourage the regime to engage constructively. We know the textbook. We've done the talking points so many times. But then the more, let's say, behind the scenes stuff, and it was fully understood from day one that actually also with my profile that I should not least also operate behind the scenes and really be as useful as I could to those actors wanting changes. And that obviously generally was, as you also were part of in Geneva and your colleagues, Paul, it was basically talking almost 24 hours a day, brainstorming, have different scenarios. And then obviously what I also zoomed in on was the opposition was to go down a certain avenue. What would the response be in capitals collectively and capitals of more importance than others? I think you also recalled that there were times when the opposition, understandably so, were actually very close to pulling the plug and leaving Geneva as a sign of protest and out of frustration. Obviously, we engaged behind the scene. What would that lead to? While we obviously understood, because the regime was not moving in inns, how it may be used against and all of that. So it was really down to a very, let's say, hands-on and concrete level that we engaged. Obviously, when people were in Geneva, but I had the autonomy and the backing that I could travel when needed, basically, and no matter the destination. So I think I did my fair share of traveling, a bit quiet on that for environmental reasons, but it was absolutely necessary also because the opposition and the relevant actors were increasingly scattered all over the world.
And how did you navigate this fragmented system? There was the UN with the other international community. There was the London Group of 11, if I recall. It had many more states than 11, but somehow the London 11 stuck as a name for the friends of the oppositions, so to speak. You had the Russians, which I'd like to talk about in just a second. But as you got up every morning and you thought, right, I'm the Danish envoy to these peace talks, and this is what the landscape looks like. This is what I'm going to do today to try to move this process forward? What were your guiding couple of principles?
I was generally, and I think that's also where my let's say my profile was a bit different, at least from fellow Danish diplomats. My entry point was primarily from a Syrian perspective and only a secondary international lens. So I took generally point of departure in that the Syrian context, Syrian actors, Syrian analysis, Syrian strategies, and the like. And then I was trying to match it with the regional or the international dimension. So starting a day would obviously be to catch up on developments overnight, and there was rarely a day when there was not a significant one, at least not in the early days of the conflict. And then obviously also benefiting from receiving different news from colleagues in the system about the ideas and thinking in key capitals, and then trying to make it all add up, and then ultimately close the circle by then advising and conveying all of that to the Syrian opposition. So that was how it was. But for me, it was important, even though I was formally special envoy to the Syrian opposition, it was never confined to the organized political opposition. It was somewhat understood that it was to engage and support and be as helpful as possible to the actors, basically wanting those fundamental changes in Damascus as a way to address the root cause of the conflict.
And so you were able to provide valuable guidance and insight to the opposition as to how to navigate that.
Exactly. And then obviously as an element we haven't talked about with details yet, but perhaps this is a good time, is because there was somewhat a triangle. We have obviously the Syrian environment, you have the bilaterals, and then you have the UN. And they were for sure in 2254 and even before mandated to somewhat facilitate that political solution. So they were sitting at the end of the table. And for that purpose, they set up an office in Geneva, the office of the special envoy. I can't even remember. I guess we saw 4 or 5 different UN special envoys up to the current one. And I think also it was, how to put it, it was a bit of an eye-opener that it was really difficult to get the UN to have a general, almost honest broker approach to a situation where somebody is challenging the recognized government of the country. There were in many ways an imbalance in that, and I should say, and against actually being the strongest supporter of multilateralism, the strongest supporter of the UN and its mandate and the charter, that I really think that the UN should do some reflection on how to engage with actors in a context like Syria, where basically those in power in the recognized capital and the recognized government are being challenged. Because it's not only how you engage, it's also how you're seen to engage. And then I recall some exchanges with UN colleagues, even in the earlier days, that some basic principles could actually improve the UN standing in that regard. And that was whenever the UN, including the UN Special Envoy, met, let's say, regime officials, or let's say a minister, he should immediately match it with having a similar level of engagement with the opposition. And not only level-wise, but also time-wise. But we saw many times that there was more engagement with regime officials, and I think it was needed because those were the ones we needed to engage. But it's also about optically how it is seen. And in the eyes of the Syrian, it was seen as if the UN is primarily going to Damascus, meeting people, and then nothing comes out of it, and even perhaps not pay the same attention to the opposition, if not even ignoring them a bit. So I think some basic measures, but it's important to acknowledge that it's not only what you do, it's also how you do it.
Yeah, no, I recall, Ivan, that the opposition was constantly and almost perpetually frustrated, not only by the asymmetry of the negotiation approaches, but by the perceived asymmetry of the United Nations relationship with the state of Syria, which was a member of the UN, and then the opposition, which was seeking democratic regime change.
If I may also add there, I recorded many meetings, and it was even at times a bit of an uphill battle to convince the UN to use certain terminology that was even fully anchored at the time we had 2254. I recall some exchanges, I think it was late 15 or late 16, where the UN was really shy on even using the term transition. And then they said, well, if we use that term, then the regime will not engage and we will upset Russia. And I kept on saying, well, I don't think that is what is going to make it break or not, or coming to Geneva or not. And based on experience, they will only use it as a pretext, because if you do use the term, there will be other reasons for not engaging. So that was a bit disappointing that there was not that determination to actually be principled and consistent, and obviously both use the mandate as given in 2254, but also acknowledge that with that mandate comes a responsibility to actually defend and promote it.
Yeah, that would not be the first time that we saw a Security Council resolution being proactive and forward-leaning, only to have it walked back by the UN Secretary General's team. Thinking back to the Balkans and all of those resolutions which were interpreted downward. You mentioned Russia. Let's talk about Russia for just a bit. Russia played a significant role. You mentioned a few moments ago that the Americans and others would provide support for the opposition with our European allies. Russia would bring the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, to the table. Russia played a significant role, but not entirely helpful role in Geneva, and then subsequently in the conflict with its military bases and the military support for the Assad regime. How did that challenge the peace process? Russia was on the Security Council, voted in favor of 2254, but then more or less undermined the process. This was a little bit of a precursor to what we see happening in Ukraine, where Russia's engaged in a war of aggression against Ukraine, and it's on the Security Council and using its power there to enhance its own strategic interests. But sticking with Syria, walk us through a little bit the role that Russia played.
Well, they were the hands-on friends of the regime, and for sure instrumental in firstly avoiding regime defeat and subsequently ensuring its survival. But I think the way I normally put it is that Russia's strategy was as simple as it was clear. Basically manipulate the international community into believing that both they and the regime would support a political solution in line with 2254. And I think, cynically speaking, they fooled many, if not everybody. And I would also say that at different times they also fooled the US into believing that, because the only aim was to play for time, and based on the premise that sooner or later the international community would actually gradually become more interested and focus on other issues like refugees and security and domestic issues that somewhat, they say, resonated in domestic political environments and the like. And then all of that would over time and accumulated translate into creeping normalization. And ultimately, actors, international ones, returning to Damascus, the regime would have not only survived, but it would have been re-legitimized, and ambassadors would have to go back to Damascus and kiss the ring. So I think that was a simple formula that they were banking on. And until last year, they actually succeeded, and we saw that the train was actually gaining significant speed. Here, if I may also just add another note on the UN, and yet again against the premise to be the strongest and most principled supporter of the UN and the framework. I think also they both knowingly and others due to poor analysis, they somewhat contribute to all of this. But I should also add with a notable exception, because in the eyes of people, the UN is one environment. So notable exceptions were actually the special UN mechanisms that were established by the Human Rights Council, like the Commission of Inquiry or the IIIM established by the General Assembly. So basically on Russia, when it came to the Security Council specifically, I think they were perfectly comfortable to let it be a talking shop. But when it got close to actually some teeth, for instance, accountability, chemical weapons, war crimes, and all of that, they pulled the veto card at times with China, and then effectively put a stop to both stating and doing the right thing.
And they have continued to adopt that playbook in their war of aggression against Ukraine. And shockingly, it still seems to work, at least to a degree. Back into Geneva, were there any specific moments in time where you thought, well, wait a second, we might have a significant breakthrough here, either in terms of the negotiations moving forward or in terms of the opposition achieving something significant for its own purposes of legitimacy or of keeping the opposition together and focused, which, as you and I both know, is exceedingly difficult in these times of conflict? Or alternatively, were there some critical setbacks and you thought, all right, this has altered the trajectory of efforts to undertake a negotiated settlement?
Yeah, I'm afraid that the setbacks definitely supersede the positive developments, because it was really just the prospect of actually successfully negotiating a principled political solution that somewhat covered the basic requirements was only getting slimmer and slimmer So some setbacks in my book included when the UN, and while I understand it, they actually zoomed in on the constitutional piece. Perhaps it's worth just reminding ourselves that when it comes to the phases of a political solution for Syria as established in 2254, it somewhat can be unpacked to four. One, we need a ceasefire. We need obviously a big calm environment to be able to advance a political solution. Two, we need new governance. Why? Because it was recognized that the then governance spearheaded by Assad was not legitimate. So we needed a new piece there to lay the basis for a new constitution, for that to be legitimate. And then on the basis of that, there could then be elections conducted. And as the UN could not get anywhere, Russia kept on not putting pressure on the regime, even though I would say if they had applied more pressure, I think the regime would still have been able to wiggle their way out of it. But that meant the UN somewhat zoomed in on the third phase of this sequence: ceasefire, new governance, constitution, and elections. And I think analytically we quickly established that while obviously we appreciate that could be a way of keeping 2254 alive and the whole idea of a political solution, it also came with significant traps, because if all of a sudden that not only became the entry point, but also the end game, it could also actually very well lead to remanifestation of the then power holders. So we insisted, and we were happy that the UN also used the terminology in their narrative that this was a potential door opener to the wider process. So we somewhat advised the UN to use that framing as often as possible to mitigate the risk that the constitution, if it were to, or the constitutional process, if it were to kick off, were basically both the beginning and the end. But overall, I would still qualify as a setback, while still yet again understand why they did, because they didn't have a lot of other ideas, even though I do think they could have been a bit more creative. Another setback for me was, yet again, in the absence of being sufficiently courageous and principled in doing stuff and being a bit risk averse, they put a lot of effort when there was no conducive environment for political negotiations between opposition and regime, put a lot of effort in establishing both a women advisory board and a civil society support room. And while obviously we all support and really encourage engagement of actors left, right, and center, personally, I found this notion of the UN establishing fora for civil society, whether it's civil society generally or women specifically, was a bit the loop-sided approach, because I would rather see that those input and engagements somewhat is bottom up and not somewhat determined and established by an international player. And then in conclusion, somewhat on this one, over years, and then let's say towards 18, 19, let's frame it a bit positively, that there were actually attempts to somewhat at least continue talking about 2254. At times there were meetings in Geneva, but as we know, they were really also reducing in numbers. But I also fully supported that we should just do something just to keep 2254 alive, because if it was formally for sure, and even de facto take it off the table, then it would be very difficult to recover from that. So the 2254 framework still provided some protection against actually that full-blown normalization, but it was declining, and then obviously also kind of in line with the train of normalization.
Ivan, let's pick up on that a little bit, because I do remember you and I had a number of conversations in Geneva with the UN, the opposition, and a number of times with the Americans about the utility of the Geneva process. Sometimes there was the appearance of activity, and sometimes there wasn't even the appearance of activity. But you felt, I felt, and others felt that it was important to at least have a process in play so that if things did change on the ground, because they changed on the ground, not in a way that we had necessarily anticipated, but at the time, if things had changed, there would be a up and running, ready-made peace process to step into. So along those lines, looking back now, what role do you think, or what impact did the Geneva process have on Syria's trajectory and what we see now with this transition, the regime change through the use of force, and now this effort at a transition to a democratic Syria? Was the Geneva process at the end of the day not at all relevant, or did it provide some momentum, or did it have some impact and help facilitate to where we are today with Syria?
I think overall relevant from a low level, but still noteworthy, and that was that it definitely contributed to keep let's say, the whole notion of politically negotiated end to the conflict alive as a simple way of also basically ensuring that the regime was not getting emboldened and empowered on its own at the expense of all other actors. But whether that could be achieved in a different way, I think that's one for a deeper reflection, because I think while obviously the opposition in the early days gained a lot of attention and support to engage in the meetings in Geneva, even though there was nobody to engage with, over time, it also became problematic that there was zero result. And that obviously also contributed to what out there in the public eye, not least on social media, then is translated into attacking opposition representatives for doing the hotel circus routes and even, let's say, 3-star plus hotels and the like. That was over time also more and more damaging to the opposition. And I don't expect those criticizing the opposition for that, not knowing that actually the opposition contributed greatly to prevent normalization. But I think those who are sufficiently involved in the Syria file and been following it, they actually would acknowledge that if it had not been for the opposition representatives, obviously backed by civil society carrying some of the same messages, we may have lost the fight against normalization even 1 or 2 years back. And if that had been the case, the 8th December last year would never have happened.
Because there might have been a more dramatic normalization with the Assad regime.
Yeah, I think we could have probably, I think the maximum we could have continue holding the fort, being basically avoiding normalization and re-legitimizing and then formally, let's say, rubber stamping the then regime was probably 1 or 2 years. And if we see now also kind of global developments, even just within the last year, attention has also been diverted to many other places. And that obviously translates that political support goes elsewhere. Money is going elsewhere and all of that. That's one of the sad parts about the geopolitics. It's the bandwidth is not unlimited.
No, I think sometimes these processes that we're engaged in have positive, unexpected consequences that we're not thinking of at that very moment. Ivan, let's talk a little bit about the current Syria. And you and I have done an earlier podcast on the transition in Syria, so I don't want to dive into it too deeply. But give me a little bit of your perception on the international community's current interaction with the government in Syria, led by the HTS, but including a number of our colleagues and friends like Hind Kabawat, who has a ministry portfolio. How is the international community adjusting to this rapid change, and could it be doing better?
Well, I think the short answer to that is yes. But perhaps before I get into concretizing that a bit, I had the privilege of visiting Damascus until a week ago. I was there until a few days before the transitional government was announced. And I think if we somewhat just unpack that a bit, because I guess we have seen the reports on the new government and many newspapers in particular, they somewhat zoom in on diversity as a numbers game about Druze and Alawi, a Christian and a Kurd. And I think obviously that is relevant, but what I rather would focus on in terms of also kind of being a significant development in the right direction is that out of the 22-member team, I think 2/3 are actually somewhat fully independent, so are not from the HTS organization, and then alone from that environment per se. But not only that, if you actually do look a bit at the bios of the ministers, not least when it comes to the ministries providing basic services, it is basically merit-based. The competencies they bring with them is just quite impressive. And I think, and that may require was a longer exchange, but generally having technocrats as those holding the political responsibility and being in charge is actually quite promising to see that those are technocrats taking that torch forward, not least in the early days of transition. So I do not hesitate to say that I think this government, yet again, is a significant step in the right direction. Obviously, it cannot stand alone. It's not the end journey. Hopefully soon there will also be discussions shaping up on what will happen then as we go through transition. And as we know, the constitutional declaration that was announced some weeks back has somewhat a 5-year duration and the like. So there again, this is a process. And I think it has the ingredients that should basically reconfirm on us in collectively supporting the collective efforts of Syrians towards this journey and towards a new Syria for all. Then coming back to your question, it was also very obvious that obviously developments on the political front, whether it's a new government or even policies and the like, that cannot stand alone, and we cannot measure that alone. We need to have urgently some basic service delivery. The needs are just massive. I don't even know where to start. And sadly enough, sanctions regime, even though the Europeans have waived them to a certain extent, there are waivers in the US, that does not translate into money trickling through yet. So this is definitely getting more and more urgent for all sorts of reasons, ranging from we need that for Syrians to keep up hope so that they can see that there are changes now and they have support and they can get better lives, but also somewhat as a way to support collective Syrian efforts, that the international community is not only those countries who are saying the right thing politically, but also actually are more hands-on on the side of the Syrian people. So I cannot stress enough that one, if the international community really want to be helpful to Syrians' collective efforts on this journey, then that is something that has to be addressed urgently.
Well, Ivan, let's pick up on that a little bit. For much of the past decade, the international community has been heavily involved, or heavily attentive, at least, to the crisis in Syria. There is now an unexpected transition. As you just noted there, they seem to be caught off guard in terms of the sanctions, some lifting, some partial lifting, not entirely sure how much international assistance to begin providing. How would you, I guess I have a multi-part question. How would you characterize the past decade of international community involvement? And I know it's ebbed and it's flowed. And what lessons do you believe the international community has learned or should have learned from this past decade? And how should they be applied to the current context that exists in Syria?
Well, I think if we look at some of the other contexts that have been hit by conflict or war within the last, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years, I think just some basic lessons learned should be brought forward. And the first one is clearly something also those in power now in Syria have learned from, and that is basically do not dismantle the state, and like was the guiding principle in Iraq, basically. A second one, and I hope the international community sufficiently will respect that as well, is do not rush for elections. I think in our previous exchange a few months back, we also touched upon that. In my view, the international community at times see elections as both a success indicator and a way also to facilitate a bit of a less engagement and the like. I cannot stress enough that when it comes to elections, when it comes to even a constitution, when it comes to all sorts of other phases in a transition, including a transition of justice, I should add, in my view, is very simple. It is not time-bound, it is condition-based, and progress and success should only be measured in terms of positive developments over time. That is, does it go in the right direction? On the bit more softer side, I think also some contexts like both Afghanistan and Nepal also definitely learned, should remind us that you also need to work on social fabric big time, the more softer side. And perhaps that's even one of the more important building blocks to address in a context which has been so polarized and conflict hidden, and where basically the social fabric was completely destroyed. So I think all of that is somewhat what is loyal to that. I think we've come a long way. I do also have a concern that the international community, and yet again, walking around in Damascus, there's really very limited international presence and engagement. And I don't only see that as a bad thing. Obviously, I see it as a bad thing if there's no international willingness to support and the like. But it was actually quite reassuring to see that, as we've seen elsewhere, that there was no army of the infamous white 4x4 vehicles. I went around in Damascus quite a bit, and over the days I was there, I think I only saw two, except for the ones parked outside the Sheraton Hotel. And so I think that also tells me that the international community is not actively and assertively engaged yet. And that also tells me that we still have an opportunity to somewhat at least put forward and stress that it is not only about what you support, but it's how you support that is important, whether it's genuinely support this new journey for Syria, and also that you make best use of your money. I think on that one, we also have to be realistic that different funding envelopes, including to Syria, will only shrink going forward in light of geopolitical development. So I think we're looking into at least a 50% cut within the next years. And if anything, that should tell us that also business as usual, which is not very cost efficient, has to be resolved. So we have to, in my view, both in terms of doing it in the right way, but also getting better bucks for the money. We have to really find ways and means to support in the local context. So in the case of Syria, it's Syrian actors, Syrian organizations and the like, and then zoom in on where others actually add value instead of just being a channel.
Yeah, Ivan, in listening to your answer to that question, you were giving me flashbacks to my time in Pristina when the roadways downtown were jammed with white 4x4s, all of the internationals creating traffic jams, wondering what they were actually doing. So I think it probably is a saving grace that there's a light international footprint, at least in terms of personnel and 4x4s on the roads in Damascus. And I agree, yeah, the investment in local civil society and local assistance providers in Syria is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, and I think also, if I may add, if time allows, I think if we are somewhat successful in establish the ground rules for engagement, really being honest and genuine in supporting the right way, then also we have to very quickly get the mechanics in place. And there, obviously, coordination is a key word. And I can also be a bit concerned that when it gets to that, it's a classical one where all international actors, they really support and love talking about coordination, but none of them wants to be coordinated. It's as simple as that.
Yes, we all support coordination as long as we're not coordinated. Completely agree. Well, I have two more questions for you, Ivan. You've been very generous with your time. My penultimate question is, you seem quite optimistic about the transition underway in Syria and Syria's future. One, can you confirm that you are in fact optimistic? Two, why are you so optimistic? And then I have a last question for you.
I think that the main reason why I'm optimistic is actually yet again based on what I hear and see among Syrians. So if we somewhat compartmentalize it a bit, as we should within the borders of Syria, Syrians, even though obviously the joy may have gone a bit down here some 3 months after 8 December, there's still hope and optimism. And basically all Syrians I spoke to, and they were coming from whether it was government, ministries, civil society, or others, they said, well, some of them said wholeheartedly, we fully support this track that has been outlined now with, let's say, those having the mandates and the formal power in Damascus. But even though those who were a bit less optimistic, they said, no, we have to support this joint road towards a new Syria. And they were also quite simple in the one-liner analysis they had, because we also acknowledge that this is the best chance we have as Syrians and Syria, if not the only chance to keep it all together. And at the end of the day, those two different analytical approaches, they add up to the same, that we should support the road that has been laid out. When it comes to the first part of your question, I think just to perhaps use the same simple way of putting it as in our last exchange, if this is to succeed and this being a new Syria for all, we have to see progress on 3 tracks in parallel: security, basic service delivery, and then the whole governance, political transition piece. We dealt a bit about the service provision and identified that as a key issue that I cannot stress enough, because we need to have hands on deck and resources to deliver services. And we dealt with the last one about there's a new government. Yet again, this is not the end. This should be a step towards something else. So that's also progressing. The first one, obviously, we, as many know, and for sure you would know, there were incidents at the coast not too long ago, and sadly enough, also leading to the death of several civilians. And obviously, while that is sad and heartbreaking, I think if we distance ourselves a bit from the emotions, it is not unheard of that in context like this, even though yet again they're not comparable, that there will be some setbacks. And I think that obviously should be dealt with. As is the case, the government was very swift in establishing an independent investigation committee. And I'm sure if you look at the names of the members of that committee, Paul, you will even recognize several lawyers who we met in Geneva over the years. So they are also kind of coming from outside and independent. But I think when it comes to assessing it and also shaping our messaging, we have to yet again not only relate to what happened, but how it is dealt with. And it was dealt with that there was a committee established. And I think this week the report is due. So that is obviously also one to follow. And also since we spoke, there has been an overall agreement between Damascus and the Northeast, the SDF. It's not a fully operational agreement, but I think also it is a promising first step to take that one forward. So all of that, the 3 pillars progressing, and what I hear and yeah, constantly hear from Syrians from the two different analytical sides. That's what gives me continued hope, and I remain quite optimistic.
Well, ever since I've known you for over a decade, Ivan, you've been optimistic. So I'm always keen to ask you that question about optimism because it helps to energize and fuel my optimism.
And I'm driven by, I also mentioned I was in South Africa at a really privileged to be a part of the constitution making process. And I remember that one day, one of my South African colleagues took me to a sports bar outside Cape Town. And even though it was a dark place and it was late at night, I could see what was written on the wall, literally. And it said, "There's always light at the end of the tunnel, and it is not the one on the oncoming train."
A 50-50 chance, I thought you were going to say, and it is the oncoming train. I remember just a quick personal story, then I'll ask you this last question. When we'd hang out together in Istanbul, you always had a story about the most recent dog or cat that you had rescued and had found a home for. And it was Betsy Popkin, who was our chief of party at the time, and I were always amazed that you were playing this central role in trying to bring about negotiated peaceful resolution of the Syria conflict, and you still found time to rescue dogs and cats in Istanbul and find families and homes for them. So
but I think it was also not completely irrelevant from a professional perspective, because if you can negotiate peace between cats, then you have actually passed the test. Yeah.
It plays to your skills. It plays to your skill set. Well, Ivan, my last question for you is, given your work in South Africa, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and other places around the globe, what is your one key takeaway for the future peace builders or the mid-career peace builders that are listening to this podcast? What do you want them to remember for the coming decades on how to build a durable peace?
It may sound a bit technical, but let me still say it. I think for me, it's key lesson learned. And it's not only applicable to, let's say, to the peace field, but know the context, know the environment before you get any fancy ideas. It's very simple. And you can only get to know the context if actually you have somebody invested time in hearing from those who are in the context. So I cannot stress enough this notion about, and that's also yet again what I would bring back perhaps a bit to the UN, and yet again really wanting them to facilitate and use the mandate they have, but also take the responsibility, is that I think they are not fully there yet when they know the context yet, because there are so fundamental changes. So I really would like to see the UN to upgrade their own analytical capacity and do a bit of their own transition, as I think I mentioned 2 months ago. But we all want this to succeed, but also we have to be a bit humble towards all of it. We have to do the opposite of all of a sudden presenting models that we are somewhat shaping up and put on the table, because at best it's neutral and at worst it is actually doing damage.
Well, Ivan, that's a great note to end on. I really appreciate you taking the time to spend with me and with our listeners, walking us through the Syrian peace process and identifying and your optimism and hope for the future in Syria. It's been a real honor and a privilege to know you for over a decade and to have worked closely with you. And I'm excited to see what you're able to help facilitate with the Syrian democratic transition as it continues. So Ivan, thank you very much for all that you do every day and for taking your precious time to share your thoughts and insights with myself and with our listeners.
Thanks a lot, Paul. It was an absolute pleasure as always. And sadly enough, we don't only have to, let's say, support the Syria's transition in the right way. These days, I suspect that there are other contexts coming up where also the right support would be immensely useful.